this session, Kim Chen, the director of Kasatria, will be speaking about how to stitch your data to achieve personalization at scale. Look, today's consumers and businesses expect personalization in their marketing, and this is no longer a luxury, but a necessity. Learn from Kim and the team at Kasatria how structuring your marketing data enables you to unlock exponential growth through hyper-personalization strategies. Over to you, Kim.
Okay, right. So when talking about personalization, right, one of the first things that we would need to evaluate is something called a user journey, right? For many of you who basically run campaigns, right, typically you would advertise, right? And seeing an ad is better than nothing, but actually you want them to click. And after they click, actually it's not enough. You want them to actually arrive to view the product. And actually viewing the product is not enough. You actually want them to apply, right? And as they go through the application process, unfortunately, this is also not enough. You want them to actually eventually attempt to make the payment, right? And assuming they pay, sometimes management actually has this narrative where in order to increase lifetime value, they want to be able to upsell and cross-sell. So this means actually after paying, many telcos will actually attempt to upsell you, for example, to perhaps upgrade your device. Maybe, for example, even consider upgrading to a video on demand package, right? So the list goes on. But from this process, traditionally, most people have used this to fuel what we call a CMO dashboard, meaning that after taking into consideration all of these data points, they typically build a single view to evaluate how many times ads are shown, together with how many times this has represented an interest to find out more, together with the number of times this has generated a commercial outcome, right? And the main narrative behind this is to actually build something called a sales funnel. Because the reality is, many people will see your ad, but not all of them will express interest in finding out more. And for the people who actually arrive, not all of them will actually take the time to evaluate the cost, and even less will take the time to pay, right? Each time someone chooses to interact with different phases of what we call your funnel, you will realize that there is something called a drop-off, or other people who lose interest halfway, right? And behind the scenes, while we can use this traditionally for attribution, a lot of these data points actually allow us to evaluate what we call intent, because from the individual campaigns that bring them here, we're actually able to use this to fuel an understanding of their intent. So I'll give you a very simple analogy, right? If I were to walk into, for example, a telco today, you will usually see an aisle with a bunch of brochures. If someone took a brochure related to a postpaid plan, I don't need to be a genius to guess that someone has an intent to get a new postpaid line soon. If someone, for example, took another brochure related to, for example, a lease line, I would also not need to be a genius to evaluate that someone has enterprise needs and they probably need internet access together with high levels of service required based on their enterprise concerns. So when we take the time to analyze all these data points, we can actually use this to build what we call a single view of the customer. Because when we talk about marketing, fundamentally, it really boils down to two very commonly used terms, supply and demand. All of the signals left behind by your customers are actually what we call digital fingerprints that can be interpreted to understand what they are interested to explore. And more importantly, you can use this strategically to evaluate which products can proactively be considered to address their needs. And assuming you take the time to get to know these customers, right? The magic question that you typically want to ask is, do I actually have other people who share similar characteristics? And how can I actually drive incremental advantage by taking the time to map all of their interests with relevant products and services to drive incremental consideration? So behind the scenes, in order for us to satisfy this, fundamentally, this is a data warehousing initiative. Because in order, for example, to obtain data sets related to their individual details, you might need to pull data from your CRM. If you wanted to be able to analyze and evaluate their intent, you probably need to pull data from your analytics platform, right? And if you wanted to be able to evaluate the list of people that come from multiple channels, for example, the people who walk into your store, the people that interact with your dealers, and even the people who are browsing on your websites and apps, right? Fundamentally, all of these come from disparate data sources that need to be consolidated before they are processed to build this single view of the customer, right? And this process typically requires, in engineering terms, we call these pipelines, right? And one of the nice things about Supermetrics is the fact that we are able to schedule, we are able to retry, and ultimately verify that all of the payloads are received before you do all of the cool stuff, which is making use of the data, right? So once you take the time to do all of this, right, one of the caveats here is moving beyond what we call a report, because many people would talk about opportunities, but to generate advantage, someone must care enough to take action and generate evidence so that management is able to take this into account, right? So behind the scenes, I'm just going to share with you a very, very simple example, right? In the past, 1 million people, when they arrive, all of them will actually see the same thing, right? If they arrive onto the website. But let's just assume that we take the time to stitch all of these dots together. If I knew that the person arriving today was actually an entrepreneur, interested to find out more about how the telco will be able to deliver an incremental advantage for its business. Knowing this, the business actually now has the opportunity to intervene by intentionally putting their best foot forward to show relevant options to drive incremental consideration. If you now notice that the behavior has changed, it seems as though we are now interacting with what we call a family unit with children. In an ideal situation, we want to, again, deliver the most suitable payload to drive what we call incremental uplift in the quality of life for the personas that we're engaging with, right? And businesses who take the time to not only get to know their customer, but ultimately respond with favorable options would definitely be able to put the odds in their favor, especially when trying to deliver what we call revenue growth across all of the different channels that they're operating in. Fundamentally, behind the scenes, right, you will probably encounter a number of platforms that need to be stitched together to enable this to move from theory to reality, right? So behind the scenes, some people may have encountered something called a customer data platform. It is a very, very fancy way of describing a list of customers together with the characteristics that allow you to evaluate what they're interested to buy, right? But assuming you want to take action, someone must take the time to define criteria, right? For example, if I'm intending to pitch, for example, a postpaid plan, right? Can I find personas that actually represent families with children, right? And assuming I can compile this list, can I then choose to send it across different channels based on criteria such as lowest cost of acquisition, highest likelihood of interaction, and ultimately even things like return on ad spend, right? Because once you take the time to orchestrate this, right, typically you will be challenged by management. Well, you've given us the song and dance, right? But do you actually have any evidence that this thing was able to drive superior advantage? This is where, at the end of the day, right, many teams typically need to run what we call an experiment, right? And based on the experiment, we want to be able to demonstrate an uplift. And based on this uplift, we can actually run what we call a sensitivity analysis to evaluate. Assuming I chose not to do anything, let's assume my revenue was 40 million. If we take the time to only expose this to 50% of the audience, we're actually able to generate a total of 50 million, right? But if we take the time to run this across everybody, we are now able to move from only 40 million all the way to 60 million, right? This narrative needs to be a playbook for everybody who wants to be able to secure not only incremental consideration when tabling this for management approval, but ultimately giving the team confidence so that you can scale this across different product lines based on strategies that are not only proven, but ultimately beneficial for your business and the consumers that you serve. So behind the scenes, once you take the time to do this, for anyone who has actually run what we call a business plan, you will be required to prepare something called a forecast, right? And the magic number that typically management wants to be able to evaluate from you is, if in the past, right, we were able to secure a certain revenue stream, right? What is the incremental uplift that we are able to demonstrate so that we can drive this forward and evaluate if this is worthwhile executing, right? And at the end of the day, let me just show you a very, very simple demo so that I can just anchor this in for you, right? Just give me a moment. Right. So what I'm going to show you is, again, it's a hypothetical scenario, right? But see, each time someone chooses to interact with your website or app, if you follow our best practices, right? For example, if you click on this video on demand package, right? Or for example, if let's say you're interested in free internet, let me just turn this off, right? So every single interaction that you undertake on your website and app can actually be captured in real time, right? So this is actually a real-time stream, right? So why do we bother doing this? It is because we want to move beyond the narrative of just telling you what we call magnitude, right? Because at the end of the day, I don't want to say that yesterday we attracted 1 million people. That's not good enough. I want to be able to distinguish between folks who are interested, for example, in an iPhone, people interested, for example, in getting a postpaid plan, people, for example, who are interested in video on demand, right? Why? Because behind the scenes, if you follow our best practices, we're actually able to build a single view of the customer. So if you zoom in into an individual, we actually know who they are, what they've paid, what's the device they use on the network, what plan they're in. These are all basic details, right? But if you follow our best practices, we're actually able to build that single view of the customer to evaluate that, hey, it looks as though this lady was interested in home internet, right? And it seems as though she was planning to upgrade her device, for example, to the latest Samsung option. If you take the time to stitch all these dots together, not only are you able to evaluate, for example, what they are engaging with across what we call the public website, you're also able to stitch what they're doing when they choose to do this over the counter and even when they're interacting across your secure framework. And assuming you take the time to stitch all these dots together, right? The magic that we actually want to be able to do here is this. We want to organize the data, right? Make it actionable. And this is where, whenever you work with Supermetrics, right, and your preferred hyperscaler, you want to be able to crunch what we call supply with demand. Because based on their preferences, you need to connect to your supply chain, right? I think earlier some of the speakers were talking about agentic options. They were talking about the fact that you can create creatives at scale, right? But the glue behind this is, do I know what they want to see? And based on what they want to see, can I then intentionally orchestrate a narrative that will put the odds in my favor? So taking the time to do this, right, requires us, again, to stitch the dots, right? So the next question that typically most people will ask here is, knowing these characteristics, do I have an understanding of other people who also share this interest, right? And this is where, in an ideal situation, you can choose to export this. Let's assume, for example, you're intending to pitch home internet, right? You can choose to assemble and send this payload through email, right? If you like, you can choose to assemble the correct creative in the correct form factor based, for example, on the channel that you wish to pursue, right? And behind the scenes, we don't just want to talk about technical execution, because fundamentally, what your boss wants to hear is results, right? And this is where we are very, very aligned to this narrative. See, let me just zoom in for you. The green line represents what we call a target that typically management will set. The blue line over here refers to what we call your day-on-day results. The dotted line refers to what we call a regression. In layman terms, what this graph aims to tell you is that, based on current trajectory, it seems as though I'm going to hit my target early, right? 2 days early. But imagine if that blue line, right, the slope was a bit lower, right? Maybe based on current trajectory, it seems as though you're going to hit your target 3 weeks late. Now, let me ask you a question. Which one do you think your boss prefers to hear? The fact that you've already had what we call a bad result after it's occurred, or the fact that you've taken the time to identify a risk before it's occurred, take the time to have a group huddle with the team to evaluate what are the strategic options available to address it, and ultimately, after taking action, observe whether we are able to steer it back into the correct trajectory. Ultimately, whenever you bet with technology, right, we want to move beyond just platforms, but what we call commercial results that stand the test of time, that ultimately your management will feel proud to hear from you. And more importantly, you actually feel that it is able to drive an incremental advantage, not only for your team, but for the people that you serve. So this is in a nutshell, how technology can be used to drive these outcomes, right? And how data can be orchestrated to fuel this advantage for the businesses that want to be able to exceed expectations. Right. So I'm actually at the tail end of my presentation already. If let's say there are any questions, I'm happy to also go over any queries. But if not, I'll hand it back to the hosts and let them continue from here.
Thank you, Kin. As Kin has showed us, with the right use of your data, you can bring your marketing from generic to a targeted customer narrative that drives actual impact. Well, time flies. We're actually on to our final session for today, which is our panel discussion. Miles, I believe you'll be moderating that session, isn't that right?
Hey, thanks, Jazz. I will be. And look, I guess I have been waiting for this one all day. As the customer success lead here for APAC at Supermetrics, there's nothing better than the chance just to be able to bring my customers on stage to tell their stories and share their insights. So let's move on to the next session.